We all know, an informed audience of the Wheeler Centre, I'm sure would all know that Melbourne was founded from Tasmania, where I've flown into today, by John Batman. Or was it John Faulkner? Even if both moved in after John Lancy. Well, what does it matter which Tasmanian John it was? The important point is that despite the fact that these men sailed from what was then the most notorious penal colony in the British Empire, they were all free. How fitting it is that first camp in August 1835 was made from the Enterprise. But I've crossed Bass Strait from Melbourne's Mother Isle this morning to tell you a different tale and expose a few simple home truths about Melbourne's founding fathers. And sadly, there were very few founding mothers, which one might have assumed would be well known after 175 years, but are still glossed over even in history books. First, the founding fathers were overwhelmingly convicts. Second, they were illegals. Third, they were Vandemonian, not Tasmanian. And I'll explain what I mean by this distinction later. So first to the convict business. The one thing most people know about the founding of Melbourne is that the city, unlike Sydney, was not founded by convicts. But the privileged so-called squatters who made up the famous Port Phillip Association and are usually described as the founders of Melbourne, only financed and organised the movement across Bass Strait. Almost none of them or any other respectable chaps were resident in the town or its environs during Melbourne's first year. When the first resident government official, William Lonsdale, arrived in September 1836, he reported that John Batman and Dr. Alexander Thompson were, and I quote, "the only persons of any respectability," unquote, present in the town. And as late as February 1837, Lonsdale reported that even though, and I quote again, "emigrants from Van Diemen's Land are constantly arriving, scarcely any of them are persons of respectability, or would be considered," quote again, "desirable members of any community." He was disappointed that the respectable portion of those who have stock in the district have not yet made this their residence. Even John Batman had not permanently relocated until April 1836, and John Faulkner left for an extended period that August. And almost none of the other celebrated squatters actually permanently crossed the strait before 1837. The long-denied truth is that Melbourne was actually founded by the squattocracy's convict workers. Although their sentences had expired, for most this only meant a conditional pardon ensuring they could never return to Britain, such men continued to be seen and to see themselves as part of the convict class. We could politely call them emancipists, but this New South Wales term was rarely used in Van Diemen's Land, as Tasmania was then called. So, moving on now to the second fact about the founders of Melbourne. They were illegals. Since this contemporary term for unauthorised boat arrivals is regularly used by our national leaders and media outlets, and has even entered the Macquarie Dictionary, I don't think it's offensive to apply it to Melbourne's founding patriarchs. Indeed, in the sense that they knowingly entered Port Phillip Bay illegally, it can even more accurately be applied to these men than contemporary asylum seekers who have, of course, the legal right to seek asylum in Australia. Nor am I using this terminology from the perspective of Aboriginal law. It is British law that I'm talking about. In 1835, the British government's position on the colonisation of Port Phillip was perfectly clear. Settlement in Australia was to be restricted to defined boundaries, and anyone settling outside these limits was deemed to be a trespasser on Crown land. Within New South Wales, which then encompassed all of what we now know as Victoria, these limits reached only about 200 kilometres from Sydney, other than a few small penal outposts. In other words, everyone moving men and sheep into what was known as the Port Phillip district was breaking the law, and they knew it. Now, one might assume that this fact about the founding of Melbourne would be central to the city's identity. One of the reasons it is not is that most historians assume that the British government was simply out of touch with Australian reality and that it was inevitable that law and policy would eventually catch up. whether it be based on a belief in providence, environmental reality, market forces, or just good old human nature, it is taken for granted that the government could not have controlled, even had it wished to, the squatters. Remarkably, it is the British government that is still deemed to be in the wrong. Judgment is focused on an out-of-touch London government rather than the lawbreakers themselves. This is certainly a novel approach to the law. No doubt a few of the convicts might have appreciated such a lenient approach to their crimes. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that in my new book, 1835, I disagree with the dominant historical paradigm. I argue the case that the migration to Port Phillip could and should have been slowed down and properly regulated. I try and confront the myth that governments did not control the migration because they could not, and dispute that the founding of Melbourne was an exemplar of the energy of private enterprise, leading bureaucratic and cumbersome governments to the promised land. I point out that while law and policy dictated by the British government might have directly opposed this illegal settlement, the colonial governments of Van Diemen's Land and later New South Wales were actually partners in the crime. The truth was that the Van Diemen's Land government operated in cahoots with the squatters, and without this tacit understanding, the flow of speculative investment that underpinned colonisation would soon have slowed to a trickle. While it would have been admittedly very difficult for the colonial government to stop men alone moving across the strait, and indeed by 1835 the coastline of the Port Phillip district was already home to a number of communities of vagabond Europeans, it was not so difficult to stop the movement of sheep, which involved a considerable expenditure of capital. The live sheep trade to Port Phillip involved a considerable risk, and if the speculators involved had been made to understand that action would be taken on illegal trespass, or even if it was just made clear that illegals would lose all future rights to lease or title, the flow of speculative capital would soon have dried up. In fact, I argue in the book that far from colonial governments always playing catch-up with private enterprise, the colonial governments, especially Governor Arthur in Hobart, came very close to leading the way. Nevertheless, while it was true that the founding of Melbourne was financed by men secure in the country houses, government offices and bank boardrooms of Van Diemen's Land, it could not have occurred without their highly distinctive labour force. So let's return to considering just who were these men sent across the strait and consider the third characteristic of the founders of Melbourne, that they were Vandemonian. In my previous book, Van Diemen's Land, which Michael very kindly alluded to, I pointed out that the term Tasmania was in use from the mid-1820s, even though the official name of the island was not changed until 1856 and the end of convict transportation. In the 1830s, it was free settler lingo. It represented the name the free settlers used for the little England that they were carefully constructing within the notorious penal colony. Van Diemen's Land was the term associated globally with convictism, and as soon as transportation ceased and self-government was granted to the free settler minority, the island's name was changed to Tasmania, and my island's convict heritage went underground. Now, everyone knows that the first settlers of Melbourne were Britons, but few remember that they were also Vandemonian Britons, let alone understand the significance of this. Far from being bumbling Englishmen in a foreign land, the Vandemonian Britons who founded Melbourne knew far more about living in the Australian bush than the Britons who first settled Sydney, or for that matter most of us today. These men undertook the tasks consequent to conquest with an efficiency which we struggle today to imagine. It is this environmental adaptation which I wrote about in Van Diemen's Land. Long environmental experience concentrated in the grasslands made these men ideal colonisers of Port Phillip grasslands. Moreover, they were battle-hardened after serving in the front line of the bloody and only just concluded Black War, which was the contemporary term for the ferocious fighting which engulfed Van Diemen's Land between 1824 and 1832. The military were next to useless in their campaign. The front-line Europeans in the fight were the convicts and former convict bushmen of the island. It was this formidable training that partially explains why, right from the start, this was such a successful, at least in European terms, colonisation. The price paid by the Aborigines for the phenomenally successful settlement was terrible. The speed of their demise, 80% of the Port Phillip population were dead by 1850, and an even greater proportion in the grasslands, was directly proportional to the speed of the land grab. As I explained in 1835, it is a false qualification to point out that most died from disease. This is no qualification. The levels of death from disease were also, as was well understood at the time, reflected the hunger, homelessness and squalid living conditions associated with rapid dispossession and forced dispersal. And to blame convict brutality for the violence and rape and vicious reprisals, as many squatters and historians have done, is also to miss the point. Many of these men were undoubtedly cruel, but they were no more responsible for the conquest than were frontline soldiers in war. A major concern of my book is to remind us that it was a political decision to let free enterprise have its reign once the British government came to reverse its land policy in 1836 and allowed squatters to go where they pleased. And thus it was a government choice that opened the floodgates to the continent's vast pasture lands and begin the resource rush that has never ended. We have got so used to the idea that Europeans could settle where they pleased that we have almost forgotten that this was not true for the first 50 years of European settlement in Australia, and was still not true in 1835, and was never true for any other British colony throughout the Empire's history. It is a measure of the extent that this decision to let white people live where they pleased and abolish all borders, boundaries and limits has become taken for granted now that we no longer even remember that there ever was a political choice concerning this. Ultimately, it proved to be this government decision made in faraway London in 1836 to remove the limits on white settlement that defined the conquest of Victoria. Nevertheless, this later history makes the first year even more interesting and important, because it is only at this time, while the colonisers were illegal, convict and Vandemonian, that comprehensive conquest was not an option. Imagine the scenario. It's a small group of whites with large numbers of valuable stock camped in one of the most densely populated regions of Australia without military protection or government sanction. Moreover, they hadn't set up camp anywhere but in a long-established Aboriginal site where the Kulin gathered regularly. In imagining the Aborigines and Europeans resident in the camp during the first year, it is most accurate not to think of the Aborigines coming into the British settlement, but a small group of Europeans coming into what remained Aboriginal land. In this context, it is no wonder that during 1835 and 1836, pragmatic policy dictated restraint. It is no wonder too that food and goods were so freely handed out, even guns, to Aboriginal people. And finally, it is no wonder that Batman and other squatters left their most experienced employees, already seasoned veterans of the cross-cultural counter in Australia, in charge of operations while they sorted out the finances and politics back in Tasmania. As I have already noted, most of the men they left behind were former convicts. But a number of others, equally critical in the first year, were Aborigines. These so-called Sydney Aborigines, employees of Batman, who had lived and worked with Batman for many years, were central players in cross-cultural negotiations that ensured the initial success of the settlement. So, wrapping it up, the founding patriarchs of Melbourne were not just illegal, convict, Vandemonian, but they were also, in some instances, Aboriginal. And more than just a couple of them were called John. Why were the founders of this fine city, that might be expected to be the subject of veneration, left out of the Melbourne story? Persecuted in law and legend, the denigrated founding fathers seemed to fade into the landscape, forgotten when they were not despised. Ultimately, no one wanted marvellous Melbourne to have been founded by this lot, and with the help of the mass immigration of the gold rush years, it didn't need to be. But such selective amnesia can be a dangerous thing. Tocqueville said that all places bear some mark of their origin, and the circumstances which accompanied their birth affect the whole term of their being. So the question for you all today, which you will know more about than me, is can we still see the convict mark in Melbourne? Could it become part of Melbourne's distinctive character, a pointer away from the homogenised global prototype which would have every city become another bland shopping mall? Is it still evident in the persistent distrust of authority, the preference for less brazen displays of wealth or success, for quiet underground acts of resistance, for the back lanes over wide boulevards? Regardless how we see its influence today, I believe that it is time to acknowledge the home truth about the founding of Melbourne and remember that this spirited city originally was, and thus forever partially remains, a Vandemonian town. It might not be an easy paternity, but I'm here to tell you that it is at very least an interesting one. Thank you.